Well, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Petter, president of Simon Fraser University, and thank you for coming out for an opportunity that is really, I think, very, very special. I know I'm excited. I hope you are too. If any of you have been watching Conan O'Brien or Jon Stewart in The Daily Show lately, or Bill Maher's Real Time with Bill Maher just last week, you will have seen a guest in each of those shows who is our guest this afternoon, and that's Robert Reich. Robert Reich is the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. I've admired Robert Reich for a long time, since he was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. And you know, in the US, they cling on to their titles, not as much as Bibles and guns, perhaps, but he's still Mr. Secretary. So we can continue to celebrate what was an amazingly successful term as Secretary of Labor. In fact, Time magazine has said that Mr. Reich's term as Secretary is one of the 10 most successful cabinet secretary terms in the 20th century, so no small achievement. He's also a major scholar and written so many books I won't even try to enumerate them. But one book in particular, The Work of Nations, has been hugely influential, particularly in this province. And some of you know I have a little political history. In the 1990s, I can tell you that that book had a profound influence not only on my thinking, but on the government of Mike Harcourt in the 1990s. Essentially, looking forward at that time to an emerging global economy, Professor Reich argued that those jurisdictions that would do well would be those that would invest in human capital, education, people like you, and the infrastructure that would support education and talent and the development of that human capital. And I think if you look around the world in the last 20 years, you'll see he's been proven very much to have been right and very prescient. Countries like Germany and the Nordic countries in Europe have succeeded because they have invested in people and invested in infrastructure. The emerging Asian economies, China, Singapore, Korea, they've done well because they've invested in human capital, in education, in infrastructure. Regrettably, in North America, we haven't followed his advice as much as we should. And as a result, you see in the United States, perhaps to a lesser extent, but still to some extent in Canada, that the economies have suffered. We've seen a loss of jobs, a decline of the middle class, and that indeed has become the focus of Professor Reich's work most recently, particularly focusing on rising inequality, on declining social mobility, and the threat that poses not just to those people who are affected, but to the whole American economy and indeed to democracy. And it's all come together. We're so lucky to have him here because it's all come together in a film that is just coming out that he stars in. And it's a great film title. It wouldn't make a great campaign slogan, Inequality for All, which really says it all. And rather than try to tell you what that film's about, we're going to show you a quick trailer, and then we'll have the man himself. So let's run the trailer for the movie.
Now, the thing you ought to know about this Mini Cooper is it is small. We are in proportion, me and my car. My name is Robert Reich. I was Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. Before that, the Carter administration. Before that, I was a special aide to Abraham Lincoln. Of all developed nations, the United States has the most unequal distribution of income, and we're surging toward even greater inequality. 1928 and 2007 become the peak years for income concentration. It looks like a suspension bridge.
Last year, we made $36,000.
I probably make $50,000 a year, working 70 hours a week.
The middle class is struggling. Now, people occasionally say to me, what nation does it better? The answer is the United States. In the decades after World War II, the economy boomed, but you had very low inequality.
Do you know Robert Reich? I do indeed. He's a communist.
When I was a kid, bigger boys would pick on me. I think it changed my life. I had to protect people from the people who would beat them up economically. Who is actually looking out for the American worker? The answer is nobody. If workers don't have power, if they don't have a voice, their wages and benefits start eroding. We are losing equal opportunity in America. Any one of you who feels cynical, just consider where we have been.
I had the privilege to see a preview of the film about a week ago. It's a great film. You got to get out and see it. But we have an even greater treat today, and that is the opportunity to welcome Secretary, Professor, movie star, Robert Reich. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, thank you, Andrew. I am just so privileged and pleased to be here. And I'll just say a couple of things, and then I will invite your questions. May I? And what I wanted to say is that Canada, as you know, is surging toward inequality, but not nearly as fast or as nearly to the extreme as your neighbor to the south. And there are interesting reasons for that, which I will get into later. But it is also important to understand. Many of you are studying economics. How many of you are economics majors or economics are you specializing in economics? A few of you. Yeah. Well, economics is interesting because it, before 1890, when the great Alfred Marshall wrote his Principles of Economics, nobody talked about economics as being a special field. It was all political economy. That's the way we thought about it in the 19th century. There wasn't a difference between politics and economics because a lot of people understood that the economy doesn't exist just out there. There's no economy in the state of nature unless you believe in social Darwinism as the principle that we ought to be guided by. No, actually, principles and rules and laws define an economy, and those laws and rules emerge from government institutions, from the courts, from legislatures, from agencies. And so to assume that the economy is separate and distinct from politics really misses the essence of what is going on. But even before that, in the 18th century, when Adam Smith wrote his Worth of Nations, there was not even political economy. He called himself a moral philosopher. And most of the people who worked in what we would now call economics or political economy or political science in the 18th century were asking the most fundamental questions, which all had to do with what is a good society? Moral philosophy, how do we achieve a good society? How do we define a good society? These days, in most academic departments, whether they're economics or political scientists or wherever, you don't have a very fine-grained discussion about the distribution of income, about what we mean by a good society, and also about the context, that is, why we might be concerned about inequality and what public policies and what politics might generate a more equal set of opportunities. I don't think anybody today is advocating equal outcomes. That would not be appropriate. We couldn't do it. It would not be good for the economy, probably not be good for society. But we are, and it's true of Canada as in the United States, increasingly concerned about equal opportunity, or the fading ideal of equal opportunity. And that, indeed, is the subject of what I'll be talking about tonight, but it's what I would really love to talk to you about as well. So let me take your questions.
Don't be shy now.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
This discussion I want to see if I can engage briefly deals with, we have these tax havens. We think of Cayman Islands or the Isle of Man, different places where we use the law to protect the accumulation of assets. And then I'm looking around at different states in the United States, and I've encountered this concept known as the dynasty trust, which exists in states like Delaware and South Dakota, where you could basically pass assets to your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, spanning many, many years. And I'm wondering, to what extent we're contributing towards the inequality and creating this aristocracy just through these estate laws. And when when people die, those inheritances going, to your children and great-grandchildren. What is that contributing to the problem?
Well, did everybody hear the question about estate laws or inheritance laws and taxes? What we've seen really around the world, mostly in the United States, is a gradual decline of inheritance taxes. Now, it's interesting when you start thinking about where they came from. In the United States, the first inheritance tax, estate tax, was enacted by the Lincoln administration. It was part of the Civil War. The principle there was that everybody, wealthy people in particular, had a special obligation when a nation was at war. Every president thereafter, during a war, raised the inheritance tax. The first time it was actually cut was in the George W. Bush administration, and that was in the middle of a war. That was during the Iraqi war. The whole language that our society uses to talk about the inheritance tax, the responsibilities, the special responsibilities of the wealthy to the common good, to the commons, basically we have lost, which has to do with another larger theme, if you indulge me for half a second. And I'm curious as to your views of whether Canada reflects the same historical trend. In the United States, after the Depression of the 1930s and World War II, you had about 25 years in the late 40s, 1950s, 1960s, where there was a memory of a great deal of social solidarity. Because in the Depression and World War II, everybody was in it together. Everybody faced the same kind of challenges. Most families faced the same hardships. And so this notion that we're all in it together, and therefore high taxes on the wealthy, sacrifices that everybody must make for the common good, was broadly accepted. And then you get to the 1980s, 1990s, and you begin to have a different social ethos. It's exemplified, obviously, by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but I don't think it's really Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They are the mouthpieces for it. But the ethos is that if everybody is as selfish as possible, it is good for the common good. That is, the way you actually improve economic performance, the way you improve a society, is to be as materialistic and self-acquisitive as you possibly can be. And there were economists who justified all of this, and there is an economic doctrine that sort of goes along with this. But the premise, the underlying premise, is that we could all do better by bettering ourselves. I think what happened was that the generation that had the sharpest memories of the Depression and World War II started to die off. And a generation that had very few direct memories of the Depression and World War II, that is, the common sacrifices required, began to come into dominance. They were very prone, very vulnerable, very susceptible to this kind of Reagan-Thatcher philosophy. Anyway, I'd just be curious about whether you see parallels or have seen parallels in Canada.
For those of us who were here in the 80s?
Yes, if anybody was here in the 80s. No, but even if you weren't here in the 80s, I mean, you have at least a memory, or your parents have memories. You have a cultural memory. Yes?
When my grandparents were younger, they had to start releasing debt, either a lender or a repeat. But today, you can't function without some level of debt in your financial picture. That's a drastic change that if we could remember back then, maybe we would feel it.
Yeah. Well, the debt, of course, in the 1930s, we had a debt bubble in 1929, and then people found themselves in deep trouble because of debt. So you had a whole generation that was worried about debt. But interestingly, what we've seen beginning in the late 1970s is that as the median wage began to level out in Canada and in the United States, the way in which the middle class and the lower middle class, the old working class we used to call it, kept their living standards up was by going deeper and deeper into debt. And so that kind of reaches a crescendo in 2008 when another debt bubble bursts. In fact, it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the two biggest debt bubbles we have had in the last 100 years occur in 1928, when the rich take home the highest percentage of total income, and in 2007 and 2008, when the rich are taking home the highest percentage of total income. Because in order to keep up their standard of living, everybody else sharing a smaller and smaller proportion of the total income of a country basically has to go into debt, and that can't be sustained. Those debt bubbles then pop. Yeah.
I'm curious, you've spoken before, I think, quite astutely about the continued existence of sort of geographic partisanship despite globalization and all the information technology, social media, whatnot. I'm curious what you feel the best way to sort of approach or attack that would be. You know, to borrow a term O'Reilly would love, you know, the vanguard party, or, you know, what would our best method be?
Best method for attacking geographic segregation by income.
Oh, not so much by income, but by political ideology.
Well, they're not entirely divorced.
Absolutely.
But there is an increasing divergence by political ideology. People tell me here in British Columbia that there's a lot of polarization. I can assure you, compared to where I come from, it's not polarization. This is kumbaya. And in the United States, the polarization is fed by a couple of things. Number one, you've got now gerrymandered electoral districts, that is, electoral districts that are designed by states to be safe for either Republicans or Democrats. That means that there's very little incentive to compromise. In fact, their fear, and it's true now even more for the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, if you are a representative in the House, your biggest fear is you are going to be in a primary contest, that is a primary contest leading up to a general election, challenged by somebody who is more extreme than you are. And that means that rather than compromise, you're going to even take a more rigid approach. Secondly, you've got very, very angry, vitriolic media that we didn't have in the country. I mean, I remembered in the 1980s, 1990s, pre-Fox News, pre-Rush Limbaugh, pre-Angry Talk Yale Radio. You know, it was still getting a little hot. Newt Gingrich came to town with his contract with America and so forth. But you now have 24/7 a lot of very angry voices. But those angry voices really reflect number three. And I think this is the most fundamental thing going on. And again, I'm interested in your perceptions of how similar you think it is in Canada. When you have so many people in the United States who are working so hard and not getting ahead, and beginning to feel like the dice are loaded, like the deck is stacked against them, they get very angry, very frustrated. They are very, very vulnerable to demagogues on the left or the right who are going to explain what has happened to them by pointing a finger of blame at some group of scapegoats. And those scapegoats might be immigrants, they might be the poor, they might be the wealthy, they might be corporations, they might be unions, they might be government, whatever. But that blame, that tendency to level blame in response to growing anxiety and frustration and anger is itself, it seems to me, very central to explaining what's going on right now. Yeah.
Just to get back to your initial remarks about the difference between Alfred Marshall and Adam Smith, it's kind of a narrow question. What do you see as the role of economics and just kind of the extreme kind of, the kind of proliferation, extreme refinement and formal methods over, say, the last 60, 70 years within economics and the role, do you see that as playing any sort of role in the sort of ideologies that have emerged?
I think it has played a role. I'm not sure it's a major causative factor. I think that many of the microeconomic models assume acquisitive self-interest, somebody who is a so-called rational, self-interested person, when in fact it blots out all of the rest of society, all of the social interactions that define who someone is, define them by the very nature of their community, that give meaning to their lives through the organization of society. And I think also the economic, you remember Alfred Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Have you all had a chance to read that at some time? Well, I would recommend it, because Alfred Hirschman, the late Alfred Hirschman, a political scientist and economist from Princeton, wrote this book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, in which he said basically the premise of economics is exit. If you have something you don't like, if it's a product you don't like, if it's a community you don't like, what you really need and what you envision as the perfect society and the perfect remedy is you've got choices, and you basically exit from the product or situation or problematic situation you don't like, and you find something better. The political scientist would say, no, it's not a matter of exit and choice, it's a matter of voice. That is, if you don't like what's going on, if you are facing a problematic situation, the real critical question is, how much voice do you have to change it? And then the third category, with regard to how you deal with problematic situations, is neither the economist's exit, nor is it the political scientist's voice. It is the sociologist's sense of community, loyalty, sometimes resignation, but sometimes it is, let us all join together and change this situation. So what Alfred Hirschman does, and I find it very useful, he combines in one set of ideas what we used to see in the 18th century as different currents that were combined simply because that was the nature of the discussion of moral philosophy. I'm not sure I answered your question. Yes. Did you have a question? Oh, okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So talking about inequality, it's kind of like three questions in one. You can choose which one to answer, or I'll answer all of them. Do you think inequality will always exist? Can we live in a fully equal society? And can inequality be good?
Inequality will always exist, obviously, because we're different.
Yep.
The real issue is not so much whether inequality is good or bad. The question is, at what point does the degree of inequality we experience in terms of income and wealth and maybe opportunity and political agency, at what point does that degree of inequality become too much, tipping over into a society that is dysfunctional, or an economy that can no longer function very well because the vast middle class doesn't have the purchasing power it needs to keep the economy going, or there's so much money at the top that your democratic process is no longer functioning because there's so much money coming from the people at the top who are infecting and undermining the democratic process. Or people are so angry that they're not getting ahead. The divisiveness generates exactly the kind of angry politics that is, fodder for demagogues. So the issue, I think, is not, is inequality good or bad? It's at what point does inequality become a huge social and economic and political problem?
Oh, hi. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about minimum wages. It seems like economists' thinking on this is evolving a bit. They used to think price floors were bad in all contexts, but maybe minimum wages might be a good thing, and increasing the minimum wage really to a higher level. Is that a good way to address inequality, or are there other things like a guaranteed basic income that you would prefer, but thinking in solutions to decrease the level of inequality?
Yeah. Our experience in the United States with the minimum wage is it's a fairly good instrument. At least it helps, particularly for female heads of household who tend to be mostly at the minimum wage. 30 years ago, most minimum wage workers were teenagers, and they were working in fast food outlets. That's no longer the case. Most minimum wage workers are now adults. 48% of them are either the major or almost major breadwinner for their families. But you see, there is a potential disincentive for employers. If you put the minimum wage up too high, the employer will automate the job or if possible, send the job to another jurisdiction that has lower wages. So you probably also need something else, like a reverse income tax, a wage supplement. We call it in the United States the earned income tax credit, but something that is a wage subsidy, so that the combination of the minimum wage and the wage subsidy, and maybe housing vouchers or food stamps or whatever, what you want to do, I think, and there's a great consensus in Canada and the United States on this, somebody working full-time should not be in poverty. And some adult with 2 children, with the adult working full-time, should not be in poverty. Now, if you take that as your baseline, then you can play with various alternative policies, including a guaranteed minimum income. They all have problems attached to them. There's no perfect solution, but some combination, depending upon the setting and depending upon the culture, might be, is I think, very necessary.
Hi, I was wondering, when you were talking about earlier how maybe when we got into the 80s, people started forgetting about the social solidarity of having gone through the Great Depression and World War II, it seems to also coincide with when baby boomers entered the workforce and started becoming more into their careers. And I was wondering about the inequality between my generation, which is not expected to be as well off as our parents, and what you would say about that.
Undoubtedly, the baby boom, which starts in about 1946 and ends at about 1964, that boom has a huge economic and sociological and political impact in our 2 societies, in fact, in most advanced countries. And if you're an early boomer, you got a double benefit because you bought your house before housing prices went up, you got your job when you didn't have to compete very much, you began savings as the stock prices all went up. If you're a late boomer, you probably got the negative side of all of those trends. You know, housing prices already high, stock prices already high, a lot of the jobs already taken. If you are post-boom, also there are various demographic advantages and disadvantages. Right now, Canada and the United States both are facing aging populations. What does this mean? Well, the downside is it means that a lot of young people are going to be financing social programs, basically Social Security, pensions, health care for a lot of older people. The good side is that a lot of jobs will be opening and there will be greater and greater demand for young people entering the workforce. I'm controlling for the business cycle now because there are fewer of you and there are more and more demands for people who will be of working age, particularly people who are college educated. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess that seems to be what everyone's saying.
Well, I didn't mean to just parrot what everybody's saying.
It is what it is.
Well, no, it's not what it is. That is, there are public policies. Right now in the United States, we are getting to the point where there are fewer than 3 workers for every retiree. Pretty soon, if the present trend continues, we're going to be down to 2 workers for every retiree. Now, the only way you can start coping with that is really through immigration, because you've got in the world huge populations of relatively poor young people who want to emigrate to relatively rich societies that are getting older. And behind the immigration debates in the United States, Canada, Europe, is this kind of demographic issue. This, if all other things being equal, if it were easy to do, obviously millions of young and relatively poor people who are ambitious, you don't immigrate if you're not ambitious, would be moving to countries that had aging populations where they were in greater and greater need.
What would you think about, for example, there's a Generation Squeeze campaign of UBC professor there, and he's advocating for increased, only $1,000 increase per capita spending for people under the age of 45 in Canada, because there's a disproportionate amount of spending on the boomer generation. And so
Undoubtedly there is a disproportionate amount of spending on the boomers, but that's because there's a disproportionate number of them. So controlling for their numbers, I would say it's imperative that every society invest in its young people in terms of the good of that society for a whole variety of reasons. But then you get into these very delicate issues about keeping people alive and the cost of keeping people alive. And I can't pretend to know the answer, but I can tell you that a few years ago, I was teaching a political science course at Berkeley, and in a particular day, the 2008 election was coming up, and I said, look, I'm going to pretend to you that I'm a politician, but I'm going to say to you what a politician would never say. I'm going to tell you the truth about every issue you can imagine, and I'm going to be politically incorrect. And one of the things I said that day was, and you know something, if you're very old, I'm going to let you die. We're just going to let you die. We're not going to spend infinite amount of money keeping you alive. We can't afford it. We've got young people, and that's part of my platform. Well, it was all done, again, as sort of a satire, but a satire that was intended to also teach. That particular statement I made, we're going to let you die, that was recorded by some student in the audience. And when President Obama presented for the first time his Affordable Care Act, and Republicans said, in there are death panels, they played what I said and said I was an advisor to the president, and that proved the point. So I'm very gun-shy about this whole subject. Yes?
Hi. Oh, sorry. So you touched a little bit on the Thatcherism, Reaganism of, bootstraps and trickle-down economics. And I think we've seen that that does not work because tax cuts continue for the wealthiest. But people's minds seem quite entrenched in still believing that. Even though Obama was elected based on taxing, the richest, people seem to support it. It still seems to be very much entrenched that you leave people, to spend their own money, and that's really the driver of the economy. So what do you think it takes to dislodge that ideology?
Well, that ideology is being dislodged according to polls, at least in the United States. And I don't know, I haven't seen polls in Canada. But many people now, having experienced, since the Reagan tax cuts, declining median household incomes, adjusted for inflation. Many people, since the George W. Bush tax cuts, seeing declining median real household incomes even more pronounced of a decline, are beginning to say, wait a minute, that trickle-down economics cannot be possibly right. The rich are getting richer, their taxes are very low, and yet they're not generating jobs, and if they're generating jobs, the jobs are lousy jobs. Something is wrong with this model. Bill de Blasio, a fellow who is now running for mayor of New York, is probably going to win that election, because he's already won the Democratic nomination, on a platform of addressing widening inequality by taxing the very wealthy to build better schools and have better schools for the poor and the lower middle class in New York City. Everybody's watching that election because this is the first time there has been a direct political assault on the edifice of trickle-down economics that you just talked about.
Your recent interview with Jon Stewart was just fantastic. You put up a graph talking about the disposable income of the middle class and how it's gone down over decades because of increasing healthcare, education, housing costs. So my question to you is, could that be addressed by political action? If so, how? Or is some of that due to the inevitability of a globalized economy?
I think that the drivers of all of this are globalization and technological change that displace workers that don't have much education. But what a nation can do is either do essentially what the United States has done since Reagan, and that is, well, that's the way it goes, kind of economic determinism, nothing we can do about it, or a nation can, through investments in education, through a progressive tax code, through investments in infrastructure, through avoiding the sorting mechanism that yields geographic sorting according to income, through regulations that make sure that the financial community doesn't get completely out of control, a variety of things. Minimum wage, I mean, we can go through, there's no magic bullet, but there are probably 20 or 30 rules of the game that are important with regard to making sure that despite globalization and technological change, there is still broad-based prosperity and equal opportunity. A nation can choose that. The fact that the United States hasn't, the fact that, I mean, Canada has to a larger extent than the United States. The Eurozone has to a larger extent than Canada, but the Eurozone has its own problems. That's kind of creating a lot of noise, so it's hard to actually see what's going on there. Yes?
Do you think that the Affordable Health Care Act will be effective in addressing inequality in access to health care?
Will the Affordable Care Act be effective in addressing inequality and access to health care in the United States? Well, it's a step in the right direction. I mean, look, in Canada, you come from a very different place. I mean, you understand the utility of a single payer plan. It's not perfect. A lot of people have complaints about it. It's true of most other advanced nations. In the United States, we have not been able to get a single payer plan. We've not even been able to get any universal health care plan. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not put it in Social Security because he was worried he could not get the American Medical Association and all of the entire establishment to go along with him, and it would sink Social Security. Harry Truman fought for it. John F. Kennedy, even Eisenhower tried for it. I was part of the Clinton administration when we tried for it. We got clobbered. The fact that Obama actually succeeded in getting the beginnings of a comprehensive healthcare system, just the beginnings. It's so modest, and it's premised on the Republicans' idea, which is not. I mean, if you ask me, it should be single payer, and it should be based on Social Security. That is payroll taxes. Everybody pays into the system, and everybody has some access or good access to minimally decent health care. But no, the Republicans for the last 30 years have been saying, if you want to do this, the only way to do it is by keeping the present system of private insurance and private health care providers and private hospitals, and just give people the equivalent of vouchers to get it. And so Democrats sort of, and Obama said, all right, I give up. We'll go do it your way. And now, of course, the Republicans have shut down the entire government because of this, because it went into effect. But there are still, right now, as of today, more than 45 million Americans who do not have any health insurance, which translates into almost no health care unless it's emergency care in emergency rooms and hospitals. You can't have a system that covers so few people. It's the most expensive system in the entire world per capita. It is the worst medical outcomes in terms of infant mortality and lifespan. It's insane, absolutely insane. Have I made myself clear?
I wanted
Yes.
to, my sort of area of interest and, I guess, expertise is in homelessness. And we are in a housing crisis in Canada here. I don't know if you guys hear about it much. Rural, urban, it's an issue across the country and across provinces. And I think it's really interesting because it intersects many issues: incomes, unemployment, mental health issues, healthcare issues, investment in infrastructure, housing stock, and aging housing stock. So I was interested what you think are solutions to homelessness and how, your ideas on that.
Well, homelessness is one of these areas where almost everything that you mentioned comes to bear. In the late 60s and early 1970s, in many of our countries, we had a move to deinstitutionalize people who were held in some sort of civil proceedings in mental hospitals. And we got them out of mental hospitals. But the great promise was we put them into community-based facilities. Nobody even knew what community-based facilities were. It sounded good. And of course, there was never any money for it because nobody ever supported it. These people are almost invisible. And that means you have a lot of your homeless population that needs help because they do have some mental problems that are not being addressed. Secondly, you have homelessness that comes from people simply being poor, not being able to afford rents. And rents are going up very, very fast. Housing prices now in the United States are now starting to go up again. And we know that over the last 40 years, and it's true in Canada and in the United States, a larger and larger percentage of family budgets are going to housing. Well, obviously, if you suddenly lose a job and you have a health crisis, or somebody in your family who is a major breadwinner also goes through any of this, you have a risk of becoming homeless. You can't pay your mortgage, you can't pay your rent. So all of these things are coming together. I would say instead of thinking about it as a housing crisis per se, we need to think about it connecting the dots holistically. It's a mental health crisis. It's a problem of inequality. It's a problem of joblessness. It's a problem, and certainly a problem of shelter and adequate housing stock, certainly. Yes?
Can you talk about the aftermath of the great financial crisis? In one of your books, you talk about how the bailouts to the banks really did not benefit the homeowners that were underwater. So I guess I'm asking, what should have been done instead? What was that?
Question about the bailouts of the big Wall Street banks. I think one of the failures of the Obama administration was in not putting conditions on the banks in terms of what they were required to do for getting these big bailouts. One of those conditions should have been helping homeowners who suddenly found themselves, because their home values dropped precipitously, underwater, owing more on their homes than their homes were worth. But the banks obviously did not do that. It was not in their it was not in their interest to do anything like that. But had the bailouts been conditioned on the banks making that kind of, taking that initiative, I think we would have seen some better results. The banks should not have been permitted to reward big bonuses to executives. The banks should have been required to agree to certain bank regulations, or at least agree not to lobby against regulation. We still have, to this day, a large portion of the Dodd-Frank Act, which was supposed to be regulating Wall Street, preventing abuses, preventing another too big to fail. It is not, the Dodd-Frank Act is not yet, even now, 5 years after the meltdown, still not law. Why? Because the big banks have been lobbying so effectively against key provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. One of the conditions should have been, you're not going to do that kind of lobbying. Did I answer your question? Yes?
You spoke earlier about sort of national solidarity and an attitude of we're all in this together and it disappearing in the 80s. How do you get that back without like a war or depression?
Well, it's a good question. How do you get back a sense of national solidarity without a war and depression when the centrifugal forces of the global economy are becoming more and more intense? Well, society, in which you are changing the definition of patriotism and nationalism from one of exclusion and sort of boasting pride, which is the nationalist and xenophobic view of patriotism, to something that is much more profound, which is that we as members of a society have obligations to one another that transcend just waving the flag. That every member of every society, by virtue of being a citizen in that society, has mutual obligations. And that definition of patriotism is something that has been submerged completely. I think that, again, leaders of all of our institutions can make that a major theme. Get rid of the xenophobia and talk about responsibilities of citizenship. Now, that's only going to go so far. I mean, your question is one that I've spent a great deal of time questioning myself about, and I honestly don't have a good response. I don't want there to be another war or another depression. But I can tell you, had the economic crisis that started in 2008 resulted in another Great Depression, as opposed to a Great Recession, had it been a Great Depression, there would have been the political will to make major structural changes in the economy that would have, by this time, generated a much more egalitarian society than we otherwise had. Don't get me wrong, I'm not wishing that we had had another Great Depression. I'm glad we didn't. But it's an irony that should not be lost on anyone. Yes?
So you've commented on how we need to be moving away from trickle-down economics and towards immigration, away from xenophobia, but it seems like internationally in the West there's a trend in the opposite direction. In the last election in Australia and Norway, well, Germany, but that's kind of unsurprising. But there was also recently a poll in France that if they redid the last presidential election, Sarkozy would have won and Le Pen would have come in second, and she's like very far right. So I'm wondering if you can comment on why you think that is.
You mean in terms of nationalist xenophobia, exclusionary nationalism?
And why there seems to be such a trend in that direction?
Well, I suggested that the question is, why does there seem to be a trend toward isolationism, exclusionary nationalism, kind of anti-immigration? Well, I suggested an answer before. That is, when you have a large portion of your population working harder than ever, getting absolutely nowhere, feeling economically insecure, that population is very ripe for a demagogue on the right or the left to come along and say, your problem is because of them. And that's one of the reasons that the situation we are now in. Now, Canada is not nearly in as dire a situation in terms of inequality or stagnant incomes as the United States. But it's why we are seeing the increasing polarization of our politics. I mean, you have far-right parties in Europe emerging, once again, out of what? Out of a tremendous economic distress. Yes?
I'm just wondering, there's some interesting and exciting news out of the States when it comes to environmentalism and social justice. And we've had Will Allen here from Milwaukee, and we've heard a lot about Van Jones doing work on environmental green jobs. And what kind of policies should we be looking at that could really shore up those sectors? Because that seems to be where good jobs are possible and young people can enter into them, and there's opportunity for growth and expansion, but without harming the environment. And I think that's the kind of development that we really are looking for.
Yes, I think it is a development that we're looking for, but it's not going to happen just out of goodwill. You need economic incentives. For example, in the United States, there was a lot of discussion in the 2008 election about a cap-and-trade system, or, as some of us supported, a carbon tax. If you had a cap-and-trade system that was more effective than what we have in Europe, or you had a genuine carbon tax that was there, proportional to the social cost of whatever emission that power plant or other source was generating of carbon dioxide, then you create incentives toward more green technologies and green jobs. You're not going to do it without public policy changes. There's been a huge amount of talk in the United States. You just reflected it, and extraordinary little action. The state of California is the leader with regard to this environmental movement in terms of public policy. And it's the leader because it is progressive. It is now, it has a majority of Democrats in the state legislature and a Democratic governor, and it's a blue state in terms of environmentalism. But it's also a leader because it's such a large jurisdiction. It has so many people. It has so much wealth. It is the 6th largest economy in the world. And when you, as a state of California, say to the automobile industry, your cars have got to meet this standard of efficiency, then, lo and behold, the auto industry has to respond. One more question. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Reich.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have? Well, but you had a question too. All right, 2 more questions. Well, I will keep my answers short.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. I'll keep my question short as well. Back to Obamacare. Could you help me understand what it is that you feel that the opponents fear the most?
Well, rational opponents or irrational opponents?
Both. Mostly irrational.
The irrational opponents, and I think they're fed a lot of lies. You know, this is Orwellian in terms of the amount of misinformation being distributed. They fear that they're going to lose the choices that they already have. They fear that there's going to be a massive takeover of the entire healthcare industry. This is the same stuff that we heard over in the United States over really the last 80 years, every time there's any kind of proposal for expanding healthcare. We heard the same thing in 1965 when Medicare was being discussed, and people, a lot of it from the medical establishment, but a lot of others, put out a lot of fear. Now, the rational people, in terms of what they fear, I think that they rationally fear that a kind of jerry-built system, jerry-rigged system, where you rely so much on private insurers and private health providers, many of them for profit. And at the same time, over here, you're telling the public, you must have health insurance, and if you don't have it now, you are going to have to buy it. If you're poor, you will get subsidies. If you are not very poor, if you're middle class, you are going to have to buy it if you don't have it. That is potentially a recipe for some problems, because there is no guarantee that the private sector is going to be competitive. You know, the antitrust laws, the anti-monopoly laws may not be strong enough to ensure the degree of competition in the private sector that makes sure that ensures good deals, or reasonably good deals, for people who are required to buy it. Now, I think that those fears are overblown. I think that what Massachusetts has done with a very similar model under, ironically, then Governor Romney, proves that it can be done, even a hybrid system like this, and it can be very popular. And this will be our last question.
Thank you. As the next generation of leaders, I'm wondering if you have any advice how to make issues of economics and government finance accessible to people who don't have a background in economics or political science.
Well, you can make a movie. Barring that, you know, when you talk in terms of numbers and abstractions, people's eyes glaze over, because they don't really live in a world of numbers and abstractions. They live in a world of their own paycheck and their own bills and the needs of their dependents and their own fears. So I would say anybody who aspires to leadership and wants to work on these issues, which I think are very central to any citizen, has got to talk about real people and real problems and real where they are. I mean, you can talk public policy, but talk public policy in terms of as it affects individuals and real people and the people you're talking with. If you had X, or if you are experiencing Y, or are you one of those people who I see all the time who has this particular problem, then what are we going to do about it? I mean, using also the pronoun we, because I think that what has happened to political discourse, at least in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada, is that the pronoun us, the pronoun we, all of those collective pronouns have been replaced by a very different set of pronouns. I mean, even higher education is now viewed as a personal investment. Well, it's not a personal investment, it's a public good. That's the way we used to talk about it, as a public good. It is a public good. It's also a personal investment. But if you get rid of the public good, then you have an entirely different discussion. Thank you all very, very much.
In answer to the last question, if you can't make a movie, what you can do is host a public square and invite someone as plain-spoken, articulate, knowledgeable, and persuasive as Robert Reich. And that's what we've chosen to do today. So thank you all very much for coming out and tapping in to the knowledge and provoking some fabulous discussion. And we are just very, very appreciative of your being here, Dr. Reich.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Reich has to be squirreled away for some media interviews, so unfortunately you can't pepper him with questions afterwards. But the good news is SFU Public Square, which is our attempt to share that knowledge more broadly with the whole community, is hosting a major event at the Orpheum Theater tonight with Dr. Reich, and Anna Maria Tremonti will be doing the interview. We have technically, all the seats have been taken, but we expect there'll be some no-shows. So if you want to take a chance, if you show up at 6:45, there may be some rush seats that are available. If you don't want to take that chance, or if that chance doesn't work out and you can get in front of your computer or your iPhone, you'll find that there's a webcast of that event, I think through the Vancouver Sun website as well as through our own website. Either way you can connect with it, and we'll also have it web archived. So thanks for coming out. I hope this is a nice little hors d'oeuvre, a little appetizer for what's to come later on. And once again, join with me in expressing our collective appreciation to Robert Reich. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I'd like to get to the interviews, and we'll pick you up.
Okay.